My name is Gloria Barnwell. It's spelled Gloria, capital Barnwell.
And when we do the interview, I'm going to have you look.
3, but I'm looking good, so we don't have to match.
Okay.
One more time with the,
No, I think we got it, Robert.
you want
I
to
think you
sync her?
should clap it again. Just
Okay, one more time.
Just
Here we
for
go.
effect.
Rolling and good to go.
Can you go in front of her face a little bit more?
Right
There
here?
you go. Got it. Thank you.
Are you rolling, Michael?
Rolling.
Okay, so why don't we do that again? So that you can sync that, because we turned off the camera. And just do that in again. So, Robert, could you come back in and do that clicker again?
Okay, one more time.
Yeah.
Good thing this is small. Ready?
As long as you don't light a flame when you're doing it.
Yeah.
That's the important part. So, Gloria, where were you living during the 1964 flood?
Right here in my house.
And where are we at?
Well, we're up in Grandma's house, the original Barnwell cabin that was built in 1930, or was built in 1921, and then they built the house around it in 1937.
And if you could describe where your house is at, where you lived during the 1964 flood, for people who don't know this area.
I'm about, 1,000 feet to the left?
But if
down
you
the
don't know
hill,
where this
down
is,
the hill a little ways.
But on Chalk Mountain.
Yes, on Chalk Mountain near Bridgeville, and been here a long time.
What were you doing during the 1964 flood?
We were doing our usual winter thing. We were feeding the cattle now and then, and just taking care of the ranch. You can't do a heck of a lot in winter, especially when it rains as much as it did that winter.
That must have felt like a lot of rain.
Oh, yeah. And my husband used to say, you know, you can tell it's going to flood because the gopher holes are shooting like artesian wells.
I haven't heard that one.
Well, that means it's all soaked up.
So the ground was really saturated.
Oh, it really was, yes.
Okay. And what happened during the flood that you remember? You can just talk about any of your memories about the 1964 flood.
Well, really, when we got up in the morning, we didn't realize it had flooded so bad. We used to have a swimming pool out here on the lawn, and it had a small slide that had come off the hillside in it, but that's the only damage we noticed here. And then, of course, I think my sister called or somebody called me and said the folks are all right, and I said, well, what's the matter? Well, of course, the water was up above the eaves in the house, and they were upstairs, and it was pretty scary.
Where was that house?
That house was at Camp Grant, which is on the Dyerville Loop Road between South Fork and McCann on the Eel River.
And they had a pretty harrowing experience there.
Oh yes, it was terrifying. They they went through the 55 flood pretty well, and it was up in the house, and of course we had all cleaned it all up before the 64 flood. Nobody expected a 64 flood in 9 years, you know. But it was lapping the upstairs, and they were prepared to go on up in the attic. But my mother went to the upstairs bathroom window and hollered out, "There's a boat." And of course the water was lapping around their knees by then, nearly up to their knees. And Robert Milligan from Weot had thought of my folks and went to see if everything was okay, and he brought his boat around, and they got out the window and into the boat. And as they were pulling away, my mother looked back and she said, "Oh, the water was gushing through the window there. They had just come out, you know, so the river was still rising."
Did they lose their place altogether?
Oh, it ruined the house completely. They didn't save anything. My dad saved his cat.
Lucky to save the kitty. That's important.
Yes, it was, well, I think it had come up mostly during the night, you know, and what preparation they could do. They didn't expect it. My folks had lived there 50 years, and the 37 flood, I think, had run between the barn and the riverbank some. The river was up a little high, And in the 55 flood, it was up into the house, and the 64 flood was a total surprise to them. And then, of course, as the river raises and the current changes, because it doesn't have to go around all the corners and things, evidently a log hit the house and pretty much totaled it. The house had a cement foundation and cement porches, but it hit it somehow that it turned it. So I think the washroom ended up where the front porch was or something. Anyway, it was pretty bad.
What did they do afterwards? Where did they live? Where did they go?
They went up on the top of the hill between South Fork and Camp Grant, and they had friends up there, and they moved in with them for a while, and then they went on in. Later, they were flown to, I think, the Ronaville Airport, and then they were taken into Eureka to my sister's house in Eureka, and they stayed there quite a while. Then later, another sister had organized a house in Santa Rosa for them, and they moved down there for a while.
So they never went back to Camp Grant?
They never went back. Well, they went back to see if there was anything that could be rescued, but there wasn't.
They didn't
It
find
was
anything?
pretty sad. Anyway, and that, of course, is where that big walnut tree is, the largest black walnut in the world, and it is dying also. It's taken it a long time, but it got silted in. My sister said the silt on the upper end of the valley was 9 feet deep and 4 feet deep on the lower end of the valley. So that flood moved a lot of dirt.
Now, did they have crops, ever plant crops in there or have a garden or anything like that in that area?
Oh, heavens, my dad had an apple orchard. The place that he bought had been Amos Hansel's nursery, and there were all sorts of kinds of apples, and the trees were fair-sized. And my dad sold apples to Eureka for years and years and years. You know, they would take a truckload of apples in, and Teresa's Market was one that bought a lot of them. Humboldt Fruit Company bought a lot of them. And then he would, for winter, put some apples in the Levia and Zentner cold storage to come out in the spring.
And was that apple?
Jen,
Yeah.
hold it for a second.
Yeah.
Are you picking up any of the dog noise, Frank?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, are you getting, yeah, you're probably
I
getting,
am.
yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm wondering if. They're little toenails.
Never
You
thought
can
of
hear
that.
them.
Sorry.
That's okay. So their apple orchard was wiped out during the flood?
No, actually, the apple trees were getting old. My dad was getting older. He was 79, but he had planted the Gravenstein orchard and the Jonathan orchard. That's two different kinds of apples. And I think he had also planted an Alberta peach orchard. And the trees were all getting old. You know, a peach tree, I think, is figured for 20 years after it is mature. And but of course they were still selling things, and some of the orchards had been taken out and they planted a lot of tomatoes. I can remember planting 15, or helping my dad plant 1,500 tomato plants during the war. And that was fascinating because later on we have to pick the tomatoes. And I enjoyed that. I really, you know, I only spent 18 years on that ranch, but you remember so much about it.
It's a beautiful place.
Yes,
That's
it
a beautiful
is.
spot.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then when I was 18, I met Philo, my husband, and or rather, we were married and moved out here. And I had never been in the hills before, you know. And one of the first things they did was put me on the hay truck to drive it on the hillside like that. So it
Yeah,
was
some
an
of these-
experience.
These roads are a little scary.
But yeah, I was raised down in the valley, and it was a big difference. But I've enjoyed it out here, and I've been here 67 years this year.
So I know you didn't know what was going on until you got that phone call, But did people find out through the radio what was going on, or how did people know what was happening to different communities?
I think my husband's mother, of course, listened to the radio some, and we knew it was flooding, but didn't realize how bad it was. And then, of course, my husband and I had gone over in the 55 flood. We went to Blocksburg and down to Fort Seward and back over the hill and down Fruitland Ridge to Camp Grant, and we could make it. The road was open. But the 64 flood, we didn't even get past Dobbins Creek because I think the bridge had washed out or something. I can't remember, but we had to come home and keep worrying. And then my sister called and said they were okay, and then we heard that they were up at the house on the hill there, so we felt a lot better then. But yeah, it was bad. And we didn't get there for several days, but then, of course, you know, there was nothing we could do. Just absolutely nothing this time. The buildings were all gone except the barn. And of course, I think the 55 building took the chicken house and something else out and what have you. But it looked very strange with nothing but the barn.
And the barn's still there.
The barn evidently was built on solid redwood, and it was below the ground, and then it was nailed real well, I guess, and was a 2-story barn that we kept hay in, and it was still there, and I think it is still there.
It is. The ground is a lot higher on it now.
It probably is. The barn had 2 approaches, you call them, and the barn was about 3 feet off the ground, but I think it was full by the time it was a horrible experience. I mean, the flood for everybody, you know, was awful. Everybody that was near it or in it. We did mostly worrying. There was nothing else we could do, actually. But then it ruined a lot of roads. We had to replace a lot of roads here on the ranch, or replace portions of the road where there were slides and washouts and what have you. But most of our culverts were big enough that it took the water. So we had problems, but nothing. I mean, nothing like what they had in the Bow area.
Did you know any other people who were affected by the flood down in the lower area?
The neighbors, I'm trying to think of it, Matson, Rose, and I forget what her husband's name was, but they were on their roof, and nobody seemed to pick them up. But they made it all right. They slept in their attic during the night. Their house, evidently, it was built as the Catholics' retreat next door to the folks' house, and it was on a little bit higher ground, though closer to the river. But it stayed, and I don't know whether they still have it there or not, but they spent the night in the attic.
We have this theory that we've thought about, because Humboldt County has so many people who are very creative, work with their hands. Maybe we survived the flood better because we have people who are more self-reliant in Humboldt County. What do you think about that?
Well, I think a lot of your older people that were here are pretty self-reliant. All the dairymen, you know, they try, but of course you can't move every cow in Ferndale up to the fairgrounds, and they lost a lot. They lost a lot of houses. And of course everybody thought they had their houses on the highest ground, you know, but I don't know. Mother Nature does strange things.
Yeah.
It's really tough.
And it seems like people really helped each other out in Humboldt County during the flood.
Oh, they definitely did. You had boats. Everybody that had a boat got out there and tried to rescue somebody, you know, and then we had helicopters and airplanes. There were several bad accidents, but mostly they saved a lot of people. So it was terrible. It was a terrible flood. And of course we've always had floods, but not that close together and not that bad. There was a flood in 1861 that was quite high, And there was one in 91 that took my great-grandmother's little dairy farm from Blue Lake and made a mess of it, you know. And then there was the 1915 flood and the 1937 flood. I remember the 37 flood because someone said, oh, it wasn't as high as the 1915 flood. Well, then they saw the Alton 1906 schoolhouse go down the river, so they had to concede that it was a little bigger than 1915. But 55 was a terrible experience, but 64 was terrible.
Seems like you are very interested in the flood because you've been tracking the numbers and the amount of time between floods. Why have you had this fascination with the floods?
Well, we had a lot of arguments with timber industry, with the environmentalists actually, who were pushing, you know, that all the fish were at the... It was a problem for the timber owners because they blamed the lack of fish on us, you know, rather than overfishing. And I also was on a state fish committee for Farm Bureau, which I met with people from the Ocean Committee and what have you. And we talked about a lot of things, but you know, they never really investigated or knew exactly what was going on in the ocean. It was kind of like a black box to them. They hadn't opened it yet. Now hopefully they know more and how the fish travel. And then we lived on the river, and my dad smoked salmon in the winter, and we ate it all spring. But just always been interested in it. In agriculture, in the land, and in the fish, and in the timber.
Because you come from a long line of people who've lived on this land or lived in this area.
Yes, I think my great-great-uncle, Stephen Hill, came with Carson, or shortly after William Carson, and they worked in the timber. And then my great-grandfather came when he was 12, or he started across the U.S. when he was 12 and worked in Wisconsin a while, and then he came on to Eureka because his uncle, or his older brother was here, I believe it was. And that was John Hill in Eureka, and my great-grandfather was John Hill and built the house there at the end of John Hill Road. And my granddad was born in Eureka. My mother was born in Blue Lake. And my husband's grandmother was born in Petrolia, so we've been here quite a while.
Wow. Amazing.
She was born in 1874 in Petrolia.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Both of my parents were born in the 1800s, so that's fascinating too when I think about it. And we had quite a family. I think my dad was looking forward to sons to work on the ranch, and he had 7 girls and 1 boy. And now they're all gone but me and one sister I have in Eureka in the hospital, or in the care home. But it's been a pretty wonderful life, actually. My husband and I raised 6 children, sent them to the Bridgeville school and on to high school. And I told somebody the other day that it took me 30 years to raise my children, you know, take care of them so they were right, proper, and did good things.
It's worth the investment.
Yes, it was.
Well, good. Is there anything else you'd like to say about the flood, the 64 flood?
Well, I'd hate to see another one.
What do you think would be different now if there was a flood of the same magnitude?
Well, I think they have the dikes built up more strongly, but who knows? Who can tell what will happen, you know? And actually, it was the snow that saved us in the 64 flood, because as the southern storm got a little weaker or moved on, the northern one moved in, and it snowed, and that stopped the rain right there. And I think it snowed down to about, probably 1,000 feet or a little lower, and there was a lot of snow. I know because I had to ride through it to feed the cows, and the men had gone down to the mouth of Larrabee Creek to help PL get some equipment out that they had covered with mud, and to open the road to the river so the boats could get across for winter. And everybody helps each other, you know. I don't know why we went down that way instead of the other way, but people seem to get on the highways and get them going pretty well. I'm sorry they've never built the railroad back, but that's the way
That's
it
a
is.
whole movie itself. That whole railroad's its own movie. Well, great. Thank you so much for spending the time with us in your home, in your beautiful place up here. This is
Oh,
wonderful.
we enjoy it. We really enjoy
I've
it.
never been out this far on this road. This is a beautiful, beautiful spot.
We have
here.
more we'd like to show you because we can, from up on top, we can see the King's Range and we can see the Humboldt Redwood Forest. And
Oh my gosh.
and
that
it's
sounds
pretty neat.
beautiful.
from this way you see Lassig's Peak and South Fork Mountain, and it's pretty neat. Our ridge runs down to Alton.
That's a
It's
long
Chalk
way.
Mountain Range.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Well, great. Thanks
kind
so
of
much.
fascinating.
Well, let me, we'll get Les hooked up here.
See without them real
Great.
well.
So tell me about your sister.
Okay, my sister and her husband both lived in Ferndale. They had a dairy there. The dairy, incidentally, was across from where the big man is there with the bale of hay. And the water was coming up, and Robert, that was my brother-in-law, and their oldest boy, or the next to the oldest, went out into the dairy barn to check on things, and I don't know whether it was milking time or not, but anyway, they couldn't get back to the house. The river was running between the barn and the house, and they figured it was too dangerous to try. And so they stayed in the barn all night. And my sister Mary was in the house with the other 3 kids. And that's the way it went during the flood. They didn't get back to the house until the river had gone down some. But it was, you know, they were okay, and the water didn't get into the house. It got up to the top of the top step, but not in the house. So they were pretty lucky that way. And what an experience, you know. I don't know what I would have done down in all that water. That's horrible.
I think it's what's hard to know too, because usually the house and the barn, you couldn't talk to each other. You didn't
No,
have
they
intercom.
didn't have any communication between it. I imagine they waved to each other. The barn wasn't too terribly far away from the house. And it was an experience, though, because the 55 flood, they lived down in Larrabee, and I think they had water in the house then, and so they moved to, in the interim in between, they moved to Ferndale and bought a dairy farm there. And we still got water. But not quite as
So
much.
many people ended up living in really high, like on the tops of hills. So many of the places where we've done interviews are on mountaintops or hilltops with people who went through the flood. They don't want to be anywhere near the river bottom anymore.
Can't blame them for that, you know, because it's a worry now. And of course, those storms don't happen all the time, or certainly not too often. And yes, I did make that. And what was the average between the storms? Was it 26 or 30 years between floods?
You said around 20.
Oh, okay. Okay,
On
it's
your
been a
notes.
long time since we had a big flood then. The water got pretty high in 90 or 91, I think. But, and I think that year we had 120 inches of rain here, which is 10 feet. But it didn't flood anywhere. It just kind of rained all winter, lightly.
I think it just went down, you know, everything has to go down to those
Oh, it
rivers,
sure does,
you know,
yeah.
eventually.
Except the snow. Snow will stay here a while. In 1937, the folks were snowed in for 44 days because they didn't have any equipment that would dig them out. They had to hand shovel the road behind the rock out here where the road narrows. And I think they could have walked out. Somebody probably walked out, but it was here a while.
44 days of being snowed in.
Well,
I
in
see
those
you have a lot of
days-
good books here.
In those days, it wasn't much different than just living out here.
That's true. Well,
Nowadays, we just get out the logging equipment and push the snow out of the way.
that is the difference,
Yes.
having that equipment.
And it's much cleaner than floodwater, I'll tell you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good. Thanks
Thank
for telling
you.
that additional story too.